At the end of the 6th century BC, the vast Persian Empire dominated an immense territory that stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus River, encompassing Upper Egypt to distant eastern lands. Its power seemed absolute, but in 499 BC, a spark of rebellion ignited the Greek cities of Asia Minor, which rose up against the rule of King Darius. Led by Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, the insurgents attacked Sardis, the Persian capital in that region, burning its sacred temples, a challenge the empire would not forget. Decades later, in the spring of 480 BC, Darius' son, King Xerxes, launched his massive army toward Athens with an unprecedented fleet and iron will. His goal was clear: to avenge the humiliation suffered at Sardis and the defeat at Marathon, and to subdue the Greek cities and turn them into another Persian province. When this threat reached Sparta, its king Leonidas made a decision that would forever mark history. He bravely confronted the invader at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, prepared to sacrifice his life and those of his brave warriors to protect the heart of Greece. Spartan society was characterized by three fundamental pillars: strict education, an implacable military structure, and a deep religious faith. The latter, although respected, sometimes limited their actions. For example, in the summer of 490 BC, the Spartans arrived late to aid Athens at the Battle of Marathon because they could not interrupt the ceremonies dedicated to Apollo, a decision that cost them dearly but was based on their devotion. In that fateful summer of 480, the Greek cities gathered at the Temple of Poseidon in Corinth to swear a sacred pact, the creation of the Hellenic League, an alliance that, although small in number, had a solid strategic plan to confront the Persian threat and defend their freedom with all its might. To confront the unstoppable Persian tide, the Greeks had no choice but to block their advance in one of those narrow and treacherous mountain passes. Only in such narrow terrain could they level the playing field and confront an enemy overwhelming in numbers. Leonidas, convinced of the importance of the strategy, took a proposal to Spartan authorities, but once again, the sacred celebrations of the Carnian festival threatened to detain him. In the end, he obtained special permission to march only with his personal guard, 300 elite Spartan warriors, their most lethal and disciplined force. For Leonidas, this wasn't just a mission to defend his people. It was an act of absolute dedication, a sacrifice destined to secure his name for eternity. But military strategy wasn't the only factor in his decision. Religion played a crucial role. Legend has it that the Oracle of Delphi announced to the Spartans that one of their two kings must die to prevent the Persians from setting foot on Greek territory. Leonidas, with courage and determination, chose to face that fate himself, ensuring that his co-ruler, Leotychides, wouldn't fall in battle. Thus, for the first time in history, a Spartan king was preparing to die in combat. Meanwhile, the Persian Empire had already conquered Thrace and Macedonia, thanks to the relentless campaigns of General Mardonius in 492 BC. This meant that, after leaving his lands behind, Xerxes would first advance through Thessaly, where the local elite decided to open a way for him without resistance. Therefore, the key point for halting the invasion was the Thermopylae Pass in southern Thessaly. Located on the shores of the Malian Gulf, opposite the island of Euboea, this narrow corridor between the sea and the imposing Pindus mountain range, the true backbone of Greece, offered only minimal space for an immense army to advance, making it the ideal location for the Greeks' final stand. In ancient times, before rivers had yet covered the region with centuries of sediment, the Thermopylae Pass was a natural gorge over a kilometer long and so narrow that in some sections barely 30 men could fit side by side. For Leonidas, this extremely narrow corridor was a key. There, the Persians' overwhelming numerical superiority would be rendered useless, as there simply wouldn't be enough space to deploy their ranks. Furthermore, a steep cliff protected the right flank, the very most vulnerable side of the hoplite formations, whose shields were held with their left arms, leaving that side exposed. But there was an even more powerful reason why this location was perfect. It offered tactical synchronization between land and naval combat. Facing Thermopylae, the narrow stretch of sea between the mainland coast and the island of Euboea provided the ideal setting for the agile Greek triremes to contain the gigantic Persian fleet, preventing them from surrounding the Hellenistic army at sea and attacking its rear. The selection of the 300 Spartans who would accompany Leonidas was not random or based on simple loyalty. It was a rigorous and almost ritualistic choice. Those who would form his personal guard, known as the Hippias or Knights, were in fact the fiercest hoplites from the center of the phalanx. Only men between the ages of 20 and 29 could aspire to be chosen, and to be selected they had to overcome grueling tests of strength, skill, endurance, and courage. What truly united them, however, wasn't technique or muscle. It was something deeper, the certainty that they were marching towards certain death. The Spartan educational system, the dreaded Goge, had prepared them to view sacrifice as the highest honor and cowardice as the worst of disgraces. In Sparta, surviving a defeat didn't mean going home. It meant losing respect, being banished from the public dining halls, receiving marks on one's tunic, and becoming an outcast that no one would want as a husband for their daughter. 2 of those 300, Pantides and Aristodemus, managed to return alive, but the price of that life was unbearable. Pantides, rejected by his people, chose to hang himself. Aristodemus, on the other hand, chose to die with honor. A year later, at the Battle of Plataea, he charged alone against the Persians, seeking the death that would restore his dignity. Such was the Spartan mentality. For them, eternal glory lay not in survival, but in falling on their feet, sword in hand, defending their land. Knowing their fate was sealed and they were marching towards certain death, Leonidas set a final condition for those who would form part as a mortal escort. Each warrior must have at least one son to ensure the continuity of his lineage. Beyond military duty, it was a way to preserve the blood of heroes, but also, perhaps, a silent test of the strength of the women who would be widowed. He himself fulfilled that mandate. His wife, the brave Queen Gorgo, had already given him an heir, Pleistarchus, who would later occupy the throne after the regencies of Cleombrotus and Pausanias. Far from tears or fear, Gorgo accepted her husband's fate with the same iron dignity that characterized the women of Sparta. In the middle of the summer of 480 BC, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans set out for the narrow pass of Thermopylae. They weren't alone. 1,000 Perusai, Spartan allies, and a contingent of Helots who wouldn't fight, but would support logistics marched alongside them. They crossed the eastern part of the Peloponnese, and as they advanced, more Greek cities joined forces. Some 4,000 soldiers joined them along the way. They crossed the Isthmus of Corinth and passed through Boeotia, where they received few reinforcements. 400 Thebans and 700 Thespians offered their help. Finally, 1,000 Phocians and Locrians, the towns closest to the impending disaster, completed the Hellenic contingent. In total, some 7,000 men marched to meet a colossal force. Nearly 200,000 Persians, led by Xerxes. Upon reaching Thermopylae, the Greeks settled down next to the remains of an ancient wall, which was quickly restored to withstand siege. There they waited. An unexpected storm battered the Persian fleet off the coast of Magnesia, sinking ships and delaying the attack. Taking advantage of the pause, Xerxes sent a message to Leonidas intended to intimidate. Surrender your weapons. But the Spartan king's response was a legend in itself. Come and get them. And so began one of the most legendary battles of all time. For 3 consecutive days, the Greeks resisted with tremendous courage. The first attack was launched by the Medes and the Cii, people subjugated by Persia. But from a first clash, it was clear that Greek training, tactics, and weaponry were on a whole new level. The Greek phalanxes, compact and ferocious, repeatedly crushed the enemy waves. Herodotus would later recount that the Persians fell by the hundreds, and for every soldier killed, another was sent in as a replacement, but they failed to break the Greek line. So Xerxes turned to his elite, the fearsome Immortals, his personal guard. But even they failed to prevail. The Greeks' long spears, their tight formation, and the Lacedaemonian experience turned the Thermopylae pass into hell for the invaders. There, in that narrow corridor between the sea and the mountains, the entire world discovered that true power lies not in numbers, but in the courage of those who are not afraid to die for their freedom. Furious at his failure to break through the Greek defense, Xerxes launched another desperate attempt. He ordered his fleet to attack the Athenians and the battle-hardened sailors of Aegina near Cape Artemisium, hoping to land behind enemy lines and catch them from the rear. But the Persian ships had still not recovered from the chaos wrought by the storm that had battered them days earlier. What followed was a fierce naval battle, with no clear winner. Meanwhile, on land, Xerxes despaired. His thousands of men were unable to breach the human wall, led by a single king, Leonidas. It was then that the most cowardly face of the tragedy appeared. A local traitor named Ephialtes appeared before the Persian king with a revelation that would change the course of the battle. There was a hidden path through the mountains that allowed one to circumvent Thermopylae and attack from the rear. That infamous act marked the beginning of the end. And it was there, faced with the imminent inevitable, that Leonidas made one of the noblest decisions in all of military history. He allowed his allies to return home. He didn't force them to share the fate he and his men had accepted from day one. Perhaps he thought there were still battles to come, and those lives would be needed. He instead chose to stay alongside the still living Spartans, the brave Persians, the helot serfs who didn't abandon him, and the Phocis warriors who also decided to fight to the bitter end. The Thespians and Thespians also remained, each for their own reasons, but with the same spirit, to die standing up. At dawn on the third day, the Persian trap closed in behind. But far from surrendering, the Greeks launched their final attack with the ferocity of those who no longer feared death. Herodotus recounts that the fighting was brutal. Many no longer had spears and fought with swords, broken shields, or even their bare hands. It was then that King Leonidas fell, surrounded by enemies and bathed in blood. The fight for his body was savage. The Greeks, like enraged beasts, defended him time and again, forcing the Persians to retreat 4 times. But the resistance came to an end. When the last offender was defeated, Xerxes personally descended onto the battlefield. He walked among the corpses until he found Leonidas, and such was his hatred that he ordered his head cut off and mounted on a stake, as a trophy of a victory tainted by rage and despair. Days passed. The Persian troops abandoned the site, and a small group of Spartans secretly returned. They found the king's remains and reverently buried them there. For decades later, Sparta sent a retinue to bring back his bones and offer him a state funeral worthy of an immortal hero. A stele bearing the names of Leonidas and his 300 brave men was erected on his tomb, and near the Acropolis, the Leonidaeum, a sanctuary in his honor, was built, where rituals venerating him as a demigod were held every year. The outcome of that battle was astonishing. More than 20,000 Persian soldiers, many of them elite, died at the hands of just a few thousand Greeks. The heroic defense of Thermopylae was not in vain. It inspired all of Greece. It was that fire that fueled the naval victory at Salamis just a month later, and that fueled the ultimate victory at Plataea a year later. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his men not only changed the course of a war, it changed the destiny of Western civilization. Their example of courage, sacrifice, and freedom became an eternal legacy. Because in that narrow pass, where the sea kisses a mountain, 300 men taught us that freedom is worth more than life. And so, in a narrow pass between the sea and the mountains, a handful of men carved their names into eternity. If this story shook you, imagine what's coming in the next videos. Subscribe now and ring the bell, so you don't miss any of these battles that shape the world.